Alright, this is a Swordsman one-shot by Marvel. It is by a writer called Dr. Alan Pokemon. He is British. I did me research on that. This is part of Marvel's current pathetic little crossover that nobody cares about, where the people aliens try to take our Earth or something. I got this because the writer, Dr. Alan Pokemon, I saw an interview with him where he was trying to sell this comic, and one of his answers was brilliant. He was like, "My name is Dr. Alan Pokemon, and when I got this job, I read all the Swordman's appearances, and all the Willow stories, and all the people alien stories." And that really made us like, that is what I want out of comic book writers. Someone who is so invested in doing these characters justice and so interested in these worlds that they didn't find the idea of putting research into a project to be a burden. Personally, I would find this a burden because this Swordman, he is attached to some of the worst stories ever, and that is what this crossover is calling back to. I won't get into it too much, by which I mean, of course I will. Back in the 70s, Steve Englehart, he had an awful run on Avengers where he introduced a Mary Sue character called Willow. Willow, she could beat all the Avengers with one hand, and all the stories started revolving around her. Every male character was in love with her, every female character was envious of her, all the bad guys fancied her, and all the stars in the sky, they were aligned to tell us how Willow is the most important person in all the cosmos. It was terrible. Steve Englehart, he left Marvel in the mid-70s and he went over to DC. And at DC, he wrote Justice League. And in Justice League 142, he introduced a new character. Except this new character was just Willow. The exact same character, same backstory, same personality, same annoying speech habits. The Justice League, they were all in love and enamoured with her, and the story wound up being all about her. Then he took Willow over to some indie publisher, and he came back to Marvel in the 80s, and he was writing 3 books, and he left every single one of them for the same reason. He kept trying to do Willow stories. First in Silver Surfer, he made the book all about Willow, and he got told to pack it in by his editor, so he left that book. Then immediately after having his story aborted on Silver Surfer, he started doing the Willow stories in West Coast Avengers, and he got told to pack it in by his editor, so he quit that book. Then immediately he started doing Willow stories in his one remaining book, Fantastic Force, and he got told to pack it in, so he left Marvel altogether. He eventually came back to Marvel in the noughties, and he did one mini-series, which is one of the worst things ever written. It's 8 issues of Willow nonsense. And like many of these crap writers do, he retcons any appearance of Willow not written by him. It's all these awful Willow stories that this big crossover is themed around. By the way, Steve Englehart is fucking mental. He properly is. His website is filled with crackpot conspiracies about how Marvel were trying to ruin his career, and how all the Batman films are word for word stolen from his unpublished Batman stories, when they are at most superficial comparisons. But this video isn't about Steve Englehart. You could be fooled by the 3 minutes I just wasted summarising his career. This video is about Dr. Alan Pokemon, who I am pleased to say it writes a decent script, a good script even, in spite of me being unable to really muster any interest in the overall plot. It's not his fault, he does his best. I just cannot be bothered to care much for a story spinning out of bad Steve Engeltine nonsense. And from the sounds of it, neither do the customers seem that interested, and most of them probably haven't suffered through all these abysmal Willow stories. There probably is a decent idea in there somewhere with the P people and their misplaced belief system, but I didn't think that Dan Slott and Al Blockwing, they're the ones to tell it. This guy, Dr. Alan Pokemon, he could do a better job than the two of them, I bet. This is very competent and good. It focuses on Swordsman, this version of Swordsman. He is the original, not the one from Thunderballs, who is my favourite one. But this Swordsman, he is like a Silver Age and Bronze Age character. He was Hawkeye's mentor and then his nemesis. He is probably most famous for being one of the first big deaths of a prominent character. He died at the end of the first Willow story, and he mostly stayed dead. But then there's this complication where actually he didn't stay dead at all. 2 issues after dying, he was resurrected as like a pea Zumba thing. But it was like not just a pea Zumba, it was like a pea person with his memories and his form. But it was a mess. It was a confusing, nonsensical mess. And Dr. Alan Pokemon, he actually does some pretty decent stuff with the P personality battling with the remnants of Swordman's personality. This is all to the end of making Swordman, or rather P Swordman, into a P villain for the main crossover, which was obviously a bit of a mandate, and as Dr. Alan Pokemon will have realised by reading them ad stories, P Swordman, he was meant to be enlightened and a pacifist and a hippie and shite like that. So here, he actually successfully weaves a story that justifies this sudden 180 by the character. I am a bit disappointed. It was very expected, but I was disappointed that we're just ignoring the cross-dressing storyline from the 90s and we're still running with Kurt Busey's pointless retcon of it. P. Swordman, he was in that one a lot. He was very much a hero in that. But because Kurt Busey said that that story was shit, none of it counts. I would have loved to see Dr. Alan Pokemon try to recontextualise that stuff and make it make sense rather than blindly ignoring it because Kurt Busey said that it doesn't count 20 years ago. I'm not talking much about this story. P. Swordman, he hates humans, but he has a human Swordman in his mind, and it's a great source of inner conflict within him. And I've not even mentioned Willow's son, who is... Well, if you thought that Willow was one of the worst characters Marvel had to offer, if you thought Willow was a terrible Mary Sue with a horrible shtick where she talks like a New Age Valley girl, well, Willow's son, he is here to prove to you that things can get much worse than Willow. One thing that I do find amusing is that Marvel, they have done this big crossover based on Steve Engeltine's stories, and they have made no effort to try and bring him into the fold and have him write a one-shot or whatever. They probably knew he'd come along and retcon all of Willow's appearances since the last time he wrote her, and he would probably take major issue with Willow's son, that character, being made into an out-and-out villain. He would hate this. By the way, can you tell us, if anyone is reading this event, can you... No, actually, hold on, let me rephrase that. Is anyone even reading this event? And if you are, have they at all referred to that story from the noughties where Willow's son destroyed the concept of rot? I need to fucking look at that comic. It is atrocious. The plot was fucking nonsense. Fannius, he had a son, except Jim Starman retconned that a year later and said that it wasn't Fannius, it was a defective clone of Fannius, which makes it even more impossible to understand. What happened was, a defective clone of Fannius, he had a child with Lady Death. Even though Lady Death isn't a character, she isn't a woman, she is the embodiment of a concept. She is the concept of death. Well, a defective clone of Fannius, not even the real Fannius, who at least was dead at one point, a defective clone of Fannius who is still alive, he somehow had a child with the concept of death. And that child was the embodiment of rot. The child was the idea of rotten, like decaying and decomposition and stuff like that. They refer to him as rot, which is why I keep saying rot. It's stupid, and that idea means that there was no such thing as decay or rusting before a defective clone of Fannius had a child with an abstract concept. Anyway, Willow and Willow's son, they are so amazing and perfect. They destroy and rid the universe of the cancerous existence of any and all rot, and so nothing ever deteriorates or decays. And yes, you absolutely can do a clever meta joke about Marvel and the art of decaying, but I'm far more obsessed with trying to explain this insane story from 15 years ago than making jokes or even fairly reviewing this comic by someone else that is much better than the sum of its parts. What we're getting here is a story to justify P. Swordsman and Willow's son developing a deep hatred for humans, and it does a pretty good job at it. There's some nice references to continuity, and it gives more motivation to the baddies in the crossover. I'm guessing more motivation than they're getting in the main series. There is the code for the first lucky person who wants to read this comic about a bunch of crap characters and mythology being written well. First come, first serve, unless Marvel's online platform is so shoddy that you can just reuse the same code like 40 times. This comic, the thing is, I didn't care for the characters or the wider story, but this is of quality. I want to see this writer get more work. He has the right attitude, and he can write what would be a crappy comic in most other hands. He can write it well. I reckon you should put him on Captain America, get that black supremacist off of Captain America, and give it to a capable writer who will not disrespect the character, his history, or the fans to make hollow political points. Or better yet, just get him to write DC books. I didn't recommend this comic, but not because of what we have here. I would suggest you maybe support this. Give Marvel a clue that this guy is worth backing. But I didn't really have a big enough fan base to really build up a writer. Like at most, there'll be like one or two people maybe look at a scan of this issue on the back of what I say. I definitely think this guy deserves the extra mile though. He came off well in the interview. He clearly doesn't find comics or reading comics to be a chore. He wants to tell the best story he can with what he has got. And he wants to tell something that makes sense to what came before, and I fully support that. I don't know if he has any other Marvel work coming out. He also did a Willow Sun one shot, but I'm not sure I can stomach that much Willow Sun in a month. But any future work from him, hopefully on more exciting properties, I definitely recommend you check out. I rate this Swordsman comic a 7 thumbs up because the concept of rot and decay, it no longer exists. So my scores cannot be corrupted and deteriorate.